Hey everyone, it's Ryan with This Smart House and welcome to another video. On today's video, we're going to take a look at how to set up Microsoft Teams presence status in Home Assistant. If you're like me and your company uses Office 365, you probably spend a lot of your life in Microsoft Teams. Whether it's in meetings or instant messaging your colleagues, our days are usually focused in the Microsoft Teams app. So to that end, having that status pulled into Home Assistant is really helpful. You can use this to drive a status light to let your family members know when you are and are not available. You can use this to kick off automations, like turning on or off certain lights, microphones, whatever you want. Now natively, there is no direct integration to bring that status into your Home Assistant instance. I've tried a few different methods, including an application that I'll mention here in just a minute, but I think this method is the best because it runs automatically in the background and doesn't require a PC to be running 24/7. Now the difficulty is the way the Microsoft API functions. The way the keys are exchanged, you're not able to typically just grab an authentication key and use that in a custom written script. Because the Graph API, which is what Microsoft uses for these type of calls, is pretty simple, but it's the authentication that's a little bit more difficult. So searching out a better option, I found this particular one on a blog post that I'll go through here in a second. So as part of this, next week's video, I'm going to show you how to build a do-it-yourself status light using a couple simple LEDs, an ESP32 or 8266, and ESP Home with some 3D printed parts. So next, let's talk about what's required to get Teams integrated with Home Assistant. All right, so before we talk about what's required for this project, let me quickly thank the author of the article that I used for this project. What inspired me was a blog post that I found by Elio Striouf. It's a great blog post he wrote back in 2020 that describes how he built a presence light using a Raspberry Pi and an LED hat. So I'm using a lot of his code, but I'm using a different methodology. So big thanks to him for developing both the method for this, and he also maintains the HomeBridge plugin that we're going to be using here. So check out his blog post. I've got it linked in the description and in my blog post as well. All right, so before we get started with the bulk of the video, let's go over what's required for this project. Now, the primary mechanism that we're going to be using to bridge between the Microsoft Cloud API and our Home Assistant is the HomeBridge integration. Now, if you caught my video on the new Nest integration, I showed you in that video how to set up the HomeBridge. So I've got a link in the description and also in the card here above. So you will need to have the HomeBridge already set up and running to be able to do this project. One thing I want to note is since I recorded that video, the developers have now removed the Portainer add-on from the community store, citing the fact that it was too powerful and could cause breakages and making people's Home Assistant instance unsupported. Now, that's true, but I don't see any risk, especially adding in one or two other items, but it's entirely up to you. On that video, I've included a link to a community add-on that you can use for Portainer as well. That is also linked in the blog post for this video, which I've got a link for here at the bottom. So an alternative to HomeBridge would be if you're running a Windows PC that can be running 24/7, you can also utilize an application called Presence Light. Now this application is pretty cool. It's available for free in the Windows Store and allows you to log in and get your presence information and send it to a variety of sources. You can have it control a local device. You can have it control Hue, LiFX, a variety of different devices. But what I use it for primarily was there's an API add-on that you can make calls to the Home Assistant cloud so that way you can send commands that way. So that is an alternative method, but it does require a PC to be on, and of course it's not supported on Mac. If this is something you'd like to see a video in the future, let me know in the comments. Now finally, let's talk about the account requirements. Now, for this specific method, you need to be using a work or school account, which means if this is a company account or something with your school, that should work for this. I don't think a personal account is going to work here because the APIs are slightly different. You might be able to modify it, but for the type of accounts that I'm going to demonstrate today, I'll be utilizing the work or school account structure for Microsoft Teams. One thing to note is that I'm the admin in my tenant, so I'm able to do a lot more things. But the two API calls that we're going to be using today, Read and Presence Read, according to the default documentation from Microsoft, are available to all users. You don't need admin credentials. However, your admin can restrict this. So if you do run into problems, you might need to check with your Office 365 or Azure administrator. All right, with all that out of the way, let's jump into HomeBridge and get this configured. So to access your Azure portal, we need to go to portal.azure.com and then sign in with our account that we want to use for this particular project. Once we've done that, we can click this Azure Active Directory button here at the top, and then we can click this plus button and go down to app registration. So we're effectively going to be creating a new application that we can call without having to continuously re-log in over and over again. So we're going to give this a name, HomeBridge Test. I'm going to tell this to only go to my current tenant. So it's a single tenant. If you have a multi-tenant, which you shouldn't need to because the scope is just going to be your account. We're just looking to find information on the account you're logging in with. So we don't need to go to another tenant, even if you have multiple tenants. So we'll leave the default setting and click register. Then let's head over to the API permissions so we can set the permission that we need. So you'll notice by default, it already sets the Microsoft Graph user.read. This is so you can read the user profile. That's required. That's one of the two that's required, and it's already there. Then we need to click add a permission, go to the Microsoft Graph button here at the top. It's a delegated permission because we're going to be using the signed in user, and scroll down to the P's. Right now we're looking for presence, which is right here. So all we care about is presence.read. This allows you to read the logged in user's presence information. Click add permissions, and that's it. One thing you will notice is it says admin consent required is no. So this means you shouldn't need your administrator's permissions to call on these. Obviously, if your admin has changed the policy, then you might, but in my case, we don't have to do that. So the last step we need to do is go to the authentication tab under manage, and right here at the bottom, it says allow public client flows. Now this is necessary because we're going to be using this no keyboard device code flow, which is similar to say how Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus does it, right? When you log into a new device, it usually pops up an alphanumeric code that then you'll go to a special website on your phone to link your account with the logged in account on your phone with your TV. Very similar in this instance, the app's going to generate a code. We're going to log into a Microsoft site as our account, and then we will go ahead and authenticate those keys so we don't have to log in over and over again. So we'll click save at the top, and now we're ready to go. So let's go back to our overview. And the two things we're going to need here are the application ID and the directory tenant ID. Those two are the ones we're going to require for this. So we'll go ahead and copy the application ID because that's the first thing we're going to need. All right, as a quick reminder, if you already have HomeBridge installed, to get to your HomeBridge instance, you need to go to the IP address of where it's installed, in my case on my Home Assistant instance, :8581. Now, you can obviously install HomeBridge on another Docker device, a Raspberry Pi or another server on your network, but I typically install mine on my Home Assistant instance. In this case, we're going to be using my backup instance. So the IP address of the backup instance, :8581 is what we're going to head to. So first of all, we want to make sure that all of our plugins are up to date so we don't run into any conflicts. So we'll go to the plugins tab and we're going to search for Graph Presence. And what we want to install is the HomeBridge Presence Switch MS Graph. So click the install button here and we'll wait a minute for it to get installed. Obviously this can vary depending on how fast your machine is. So after the plugin is installed, you'll notice the config window will pop up. It has a name, which you can give it any name you want. Here, we'll just call this team status. And we need to paste in that Azure application ID that we got from our Azure portal. Now in my case, I need the tenant ID, so I'm gonna go ahead and copy that. Now, one thing to note is I have noticed that a lot of times when you make a configuration change, it doesn't actually apply it to the config. You have to actually type the config in manually. So we're going to do that as a secondary step. So if you're curious why you pasting the tenant ID in and then adding it in manually, it's because it doesn't seem to save it. We'll hit save here. And before we restart, let's check the config. And you'll notice the name saved, the app ID saved, but the tenant ID did not save. So I'm going to go ahead and do a return here. We'll type in tenant ID. Now remember, this is all lowercase except for the I in ID. Make sure you don't have two uppercase letters at the end. That will cause it not to work. So we're going to put a colon in here and then we'll use a quote. And we're going to pop back over here and snatch our tenant ID and we're going to paste that in here. Now you can ignore all the rest of these items. We're going to go ahead and delete them because I don't want any additional keys in here. I find that runs into some issues. So all we really need is the name, app ID, tenant ID, interval, which this is how many minutes between API calls. So right now we have it set for the default of 1. The light type is optional, but we're gonna leave it in there anyway. Now you'll see the key here for debug. We want to change this to true because if we run into any problems, this will give us some extended information. It looks like, oh, and I forgot a comma. So don't forget to put a comma at the end of every line except for the last one. Click save, then we'll click the restart button up here. This should only take about 30 seconds to restart your HomeBridge. All right, so now it's back up and running. If you look at the log, you'll notice there's no new devices detected. That's because the first thing we need to do is go to accessories, And down here at the bottom, you'll see team status. Now you may notice I have other presence indicators in here. That's because I've done this a few times. So if you have accessories that get added, you will have to manually remove them. So which you can do that by ticking here and saying hide this accessory. So anyway, that's why you see all those duplicates. The one I care about is this team status down here at the bottom. Now it will not perform any API calls when this button is turned off. So we want to make sure we toggle this on, and then we can pop back into our logs and see what's going on here. All right, so then down here, now we see we've got to sign in, use a web browser to open the page, microsoft.com/device login, and enter this code to authenticate. So I'm gonna grab that code and I'm gonna click on that link, and that's gonna open up. And since I'm already signed in as this account, I don't need to sign in again, but you may be prompted to sign in if this is a different device. I'm gonna go paste that code in and hit next, and that's gonna say for you to pick an account, and then accept. Now, since in this case, I don't want to consent for the whole organization because I don't want this, I'm only going to use this for mine. Again, this is only because I'm an admin. And click accept, and that's it. You've signed into HomeBridge test. So let's pop back over to HomeBridge. And now if we look at the bottom of the log, we see MS Graph response, availability is busy. And if I bring up my teams, so if we now go over to the accessories, you'll notice the switch for switch busy team status is now on. So what that means is that these switches are going to turn on whichever status you happen to have. So if you're available, it'll be this one, away, do not disturb, and offline. So those are all the statuses that are currently available with this integration. He does note in the documentation you can add some custom statuses if you wanted to, but that's beyond the scope of this particular one. So check the GitHub page, which I've got linked below, if you want more information. So there we go. Now we've got the information we need in HomeBridge. So the next step is to go ahead and get it configured for Home Assistant, and then we'll create a input. Then we can start using that in automations. All right, now that we've got everything set up in HomeBridge, let's jump back into our Home Assistant instance and get everything configured there. So one thing I want to note beforehand is something I just discovered. I had actually removed my HomeBridge integration from Home Assistant and then try to re-add it in later on. And you can't do that directly because the HomeBridge thinks it's still paired to that original device. So I did figure out a way to clear that out. If you go into your HomeBridge, you click on the three dots in the corner, go to HomeBridge settings, scroll down under the reset header. There's unpaired bridges, cameras, TVs, and external accessories. Click that and then delete the HomeBridge. Right here, we're clicking this button and then restart your HomeBridge. Then it will show up again. In Home Assistant. So I was struggling for that about 30 minutes. I got that figured out. So now we can continue. I'm gonna hop back into my test environment on my Home Assistant, go to configuration. Of course, if you already have the HomeBridge instance set up, you don't need to do this step. You'll just need to refresh your HomeBridge or reboot Home Assistant. But since I don't have that configured right now, it shows up here as discovered. So I'll click configure and it's going to ask for the pairing code. So I pop back into my HomeBridge here and go to the main page and grab this pairing code right here and paste that in and hit submit. Now you'll notice we have two items in here, the HomeBridge itself and the team status that we configured before. So if I click on two devices, team status, we'll see all the switches that I currently have for there, but you'll notice they're all named team status. So that's a bit of a pain because they're actually identified as team status _2, team status _3. So to suss that out, what we need to do is pop back into HomeBridge, go to accessories, make sure we turn on the team status so that it starts pulling. And then if we go back into Home Assistant, we'll notice we have two switches that are turned on. Now the team status switch without any numbers behind it, this is actually the polling. So I'm gonna call it team status polling. This is the switch that we need to make sure is turned on every time the HomeBridge is restarted, because without this, it's not gonna update the statuses. And then if we go into our HomeBridge, we'll notice that available status is set. So we know that that's what that switch means. So we'll go down here, click on the other one that's turned on, and we can actually rename this one to team status available. To quickly find the rest of these, all you have to do is you can turn these on manually. Obviously, they're going to be out of sync and they'll turn off automatically. But if I turn on this one for away and I pop back into configuration, we'll see this one's lit up. And you'll notice after it refreshes, it will turn off the switches that are not currently active. So you could obviously add this right to your Home Assistant instance, and then every time you want to see, so you can just go ahead and add these into your Home Assistant instance as is and use a particular status and go from there. But I'm going to show you real quickly how to set up an input select so you'll actually have a variable that changes depending on what status it is. So instead of having to add 5 devices in there, you can just add the one and then use that in something else. So to do that, we'll go to configuration And you'll notice I'm still using the old version here. Obviously, these are in different submenus now in the newer version, but my test instance is still on an older version. Helpers, go to Add Helper, and we're going to do a drop down, and we're going to call this one Teams Status. And we'll make this the account. And then for options, we're going to say available, busy, away, do not disturb, offline, and that should be all of them. All right, we'll hit create. And now we have a new input select that we can change statuses for. So to have this be automated, we need to go and make 2 automations. So we'll go to configuration, automations, and create a new automation. Now this first automation we're going to create is going to be used to make sure that that polling switch is turned on when we want to check our team status. So you could do this between your work hours, say 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, or however you could have it set for 24 hours a day. If you wanted it, when Home Assistant boots up, you could have it turn that on, or whatever schedule you want. But in my example, I'm going to go ahead and set it from like 7 to 6, which is about the hours that I'm typically active on Teams. So I'm going to go ahead and go in here and say Teams status polling. So for trigger, we're going to do time, and we want this to come on at 0700. And then under actions, we want to say call a service, switch, turn on, and pick that entity, team status. So at 7 a.m., that's going to turn this switch on, and it's going to start polling your team's status and reporting that back to Home Assistant. Once that finishes saving, we can go up here and click duplicate automation, and we're going to change this one to polling off. And then we're going to pick our close time, which again, I'm going to say 1800 hours. And all we need to do is change our service from switch turn on to switch turn off and pick that same target. Now, if you wanted to use an offline state, so for example, you want to say, hey, I don't care what team says at 6 o'clock, I want to be offline. I don't want to have that status updated anymore in Home Assistant, but I want it to show us offline. Then all we have to do is add another service down here and say call service, switch turn on. And then we're just going to turn on our offline. So what this is going to do at 6 p.m., it's going to stop pulling the team status, and then it's going to turn on the offline status. So that way that will stay on until you reactivate the polling. Then it will turn that off whenever it polls the next time to get your available or whatever your status happens to be. So we're going to click save. And now we have 2 automations, one to turn on the polling, one to turn off the polling. So that's all good and grand. Now we want to create a new automation, our final automation. And this is going to be Teams Status Input Select. So we want to set our trigger to be every time that any of those switches change status. So we want to go to state, and from the entity, we need to pick our team status changing. So anytime any of these change statuses, we want it to run this automation. So we'll need to repeat this for all of the switches that we have in there. That way, if any of them change status, we'll know. So you can either do this by continuing to click add trigger, or you can click up here, edit in YAML, and then just copy paste this over and over again. So either way, it's up to you. All right, so now we have all of our switches. If any of them change status, it's going to run this automation. Then under actions, we want to select choose. This will allow us to do some branching conditions. So for the first condition, we're going to select state. We're going to select our available. And if it is on, then we want to branch into this part of the automation. So we're going to click actions, go to call service. We want to use the input select option. We're going to pick our entity, and we're going to select our team status. And then for option, we're going to set it to available. Make sure this matches exactly to the states that we set up in the last step, because if you don't, then it's not going to actually update them. We'll do another option. Here's another quick tip that you can do. Again, go up here and go to edit in YAML. And instead of doing this over and over and over again, you can just grab from the -choose all the way down to available, hit a return, and then paste it again. So we're going to do this 5 times. And of course, I already have this automation on the blog post, so you can just copy paste it and then replace it with your particular system variable names, but this just shows you how to do it. So for each of these, we want to do the name that we created. So team status busy, change this to busy, away to away, DND to DND, and then offline to offline. All right, we'll go ahead and hit save. And then once everything comes back up again, we can go ahead and test this automation by running it manually and making sure that our input select changes to the proper status. So let's go to overview, and I'm gonna go ahead and quickly add this to my home page here. Add card, entity, and this will be input select team status. So it's currently unavailable, which is correct. Of course, you can manually change it here, but that's not going to change it on the team side. And then after a minute, it'll set it back to whatever it was supposed to be. So since available is the default, it's going to set that there, and we will change it to busy. So now I notice here, my status shows busy, and within a minute, the next time it refreshes, this should change. And there we go. Now our team status has been updated to busy. So there we go. Now, as we change team statuses, or it automatically changes, it's going to immediately apply it right here in Home Assistant. And now we can use that data to power a status light, automations, what have you. So this is going to be very powerful. It's going to allow you to do a lot of different things with your Home Assistant, bringing that in, especially since a lot of us are working from home now. So that leads me to next week's video, which is where I'm going to show you how to make one of these, which is a little presence light that costs probably $7 total in parts. This is a 3D printed case that I scaled up from another user and did a few modifications to it to make it my own. It runs ESP Home, and you can use Home Assistant to change the color on here, and it's great for telling your kids not to open your door while you're recording or on a meeting or what have you. So stay tuned. That's next week's video that I'll show you how to make this. So if you like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. That way you'll be notified about all my new videos that come out weekly. Now, I've got a variety of videos coming up over the next few weeks, from hardware reviews to more DIY projects. So if there's anything you'd like to see in particular, please let me know in the comments below. So if you'd like to see more videos on Home Assistant guides, click this playlist here. If you'd like to see the video that I talked about with the Nest integration, click the video link right up here. And as always, if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to the channel by clicking our logo right here. Thanks again. I'll see you next week.